The notice had been up since dawn. Arthur Vance read it aloud to the men gathered outside Corley's dry goods store, his voice pitched high so every soul on the boardwalk could hear him clearly over the bite of the January wind. He held the paper at arm's length like a man handling something that smelled. Must be capable of felling timber, setting a full trap line, and managing livestock through hard freeze without assistance. He paused. Let the men chew on it. Must not require instruction in basic field dressing. Must demonstrate working knowledge of... He stopped again, turned to the crowd, eyebrows climbing. Field dressing, gentlemen. The laughter started low. Then it didn't. Someone in the back called her a word that had nothing to do with horses. 3 others picked it up and turned it into a song. A man named DeWitt, who had lost 2 fingers to frostbite the previous February, wiped his eyes and said he'd give a silver dollar to any fool dumb enough to haul himself up Iron Ridge for a woman who'd written down rules like she was hiring a warhorse. Another man said she might as well post the notice in a graveyard, because that's where any man who answered it would end up either frozen stiff or henpecked to the same condition. Arthur folded the paper, once deliberate, tucked it under his arm. Not a man in 3 counties will touch that ridge for her, he said. Not with those demands. She'll be dead before March, and the land'll revert clean. He said it quietly enough that it meant something. Nobody saw Beatrix until she was already in the middle of them. She had come in from the South Street, her gray mare moving slow and even through the slush. She wore no hat. Her dark coat was open at the collar, despite the cold, and her jaw was set in the particular way of someone who has already decided everything that matters and is simply waiting for the present moment to be over. She did not look at the men who stepped back. She did not look at DeWitt or the man beside him. She looked at Arthur. He met her eyes for exactly 1 second, and then looked at his boots. She stepped down from the mare, walked to the board, and pulled the notice free in one motion. The tack pinged off the wood and dropped in the mud. She rolled the paper tight, held it at her side, and turned to face Arthur, where he stood with the crowd ranked up behind him like something he'd built. She didn't say a word, just looked at him the way you'd look at a warped floorboard. Something in need of replacing, possibly beyond it. Then she turned, put her boot in the stirrup, and swung up. The wind off the mountain had gone gray and thick at the northern edge of town, the kind of sky that didn't make promises. She shook the reins once, clicked her tongue, and the mare moved out. At the edge of the street where the road bent north toward the ridge, her hand opened. The rolled notice fell. It landed in the mud beside the wheel rut, caught a little water, and began to unfold at one corner. The ink ran some, not enough to matter. The men behind her said things she didn't turn around to hear. She rode into the gray. The snow started before she cleared the tree line, not soft, but sideways, the kind that found every gap in your collar and didn't apologize for it. The mare pinned her ears and kept moving. Beatrix kept her eyes up, watching the ridgeline disappear into white. She did not look back at the paper. She did not look back at the town. In the mud behind her, the notice lay open in the slush, its edges curling up slow in the cold, the words still readable to anyone who cared to stop and read them. No one did. Not yet. The oak split clean. Beatrix drove them all down through the round, kicked the 2 halves apart with her boot, and bent to stack them without stopping to breathe. Her hands had stopped hurting 3 days ago. Now they just moved stiff in the mornings, functional by midday, bleeding some at the knuckle creases where the cold had cracked the skin open and the work kept cracking it again. She didn't wrap them. Wrapping slowed the work, and the work was the only thing standing between her and a dead stove by February. Iron Ridge at mid-January had a particular silence that had nothing peaceful in it. The pines held snow until a branch gave, then dropped it all at once, a sudden crack, and a white collapse that sounded every time like something falling that wouldn't get back up. The wind moved through the upper ridge in a low, continuous note, not howling, steadier than that. The sound a thing makes when it has decided to outlast you. She had 43 chords split, She needed 60 before the next storm front. By lantern light, she braided cord from the coils of raw hemp she'd packed up on the second trip, her fingers working the pattern without her eyes needing to watch. Outside, the traps were set in a line that ran east, along the creek bed. 12 of them baited, spaced the way her father had shown her when she was 9, and he was still alive to show her things. She'd checked them at first light and found 2 rabbits and a marten. The marten was better. The marten meant she could trade fur come spring, if there was a spring. She didn't let herself think past the next cord of wood, the next trapline check, the next meal. The mountain rewarded nothing but the immediate. She was rethreading the braid when the mare shifted in the stall and stamped once, not the stamp of cold, but the stamp of something noticed. Beatrix set the cord down, picked up the Winchester from where it leaned against the wall, waited. Nothing came. She stood at the frost-edged window for a full minute, looking down through the tree line toward the long slope that dropped toward town. The snow below was unmarked. The light was already going flat and gray, the way it did an hour before dark in January, everything losing its edge. She went back to her braid. She didn't see him. He was already gone by then, had been watching from the tree line below the east-facing cliff face upwind, still as a man who has spent 20 years learning how to be part of a landscape rather than moving through it. Silas had come up the south approach before noon following no trail because there was no trail reading the slope, the way some men read a page. He'd found the trapline first, stood over it for a long moment, studying the spacing, the angle of the stakes, the specific knot used to anchor the trigger mechanism. He crouched down and looked at the knot for a while without touching it. Then he'd moved higher to where the woodpile was visible through a gap in the pines and watched her work. He watched for a long time. When he finally turned to go back down the mountain, he reached into the inner pocket of his coat and drew out a piece of paper. It had been folded 4 times carefully, and the outside was stained dark from the mud it had been lying in when he picked it up off the street 2 weeks ago. He unfolded it there in the cold, in the fading afternoon light, and read it again. Not fast. Twice through slow, the way you read something you're trying to fix in memory. The wind moved through the trees. Snow fell from a high branch somewhere to his left. He folded the paper back along its original creases, slid it into his breast pocket, and buttoned the coat over it. Then he went down the mountain. In the cabin above him, the lantern burned steady in the window, small and orange against all that dark visible for a long way down the slope. He didn't look back at it, but he didn't move fast either. The storm hit on a Thursday. Beatrix knew it was Thursday because she'd been marking days on the cabin wall with a nail, a habit from her father, who said a person who loses track of the calendar loses track of themselves next. By Thursday, she had 49 cords split and stacked under the lean-to, 11 traps still running, and a stove that ate wood faster than she'd calculated. The wind came first. Then the sky dropped. Not the steady gray of normal snowfall. This was a wall, white and moving and loud, the kind that turned 10 feet of open ground into a guess. The temperature fell so fast, the water in the tin cup on the windowsill skinned over in under an hour. The mare was in the stall. The stove was loaded. Beatrix sat on the floor beside it, with her back against the warm iron and her eyes closed, rationing herself. Rest the way she rationed everything else. She heard the horses before she heard the men. More than one animal. Coming up the south approach, she had the Winchester off the wall and the door cracked 2 inches before the lead horse cleared the tree line. 4 riders, 1 wagon. She recognized the bay gelding in front. Arthur Vance had ridden it to every land auction in the county for 6 years. She opened the door and stood in it. Arthur dismounted without hurry, like a man arriving at a property already his. His coat was good wool, his boots were dry, and he had 2 men flanking him whose names she didn't know, but whose function was obvious. A 4th man stayed with the wagon. He stopped 8 feet from the porch. "Hard winter," he said. She didn't answer. "Harder alone." He looked at the woodpile, the cabin, the stovepipe pushing smoke sideways in the gale. Something in his face did a calculation. "I've come to help you settle your situation, Beatrix." "My situation is settled. Your note on the bank is not." He reached into his coat, produced a folded paper. $240 due in April. You haven't the stock to cover it, and you haven't a partner to share the labor. He paused. "I'll retire the note. Today, in exchange for the deed to the North 40 and a reasonable arrangement." The wind hit the cabin hard enough to move the smoke sideways. "A reasonable arrangement," she said. "You're a practical woman. I've always said so." His voice had a warmth in it that had no heat behind it. "No woman your size, your age, with your particular—" He looked at her hands. Her cracked knuckles, the nail on her left index finger that had gone black from a maul strike a week back. History of Choices finds herself in offers like this more than once. The men below aren't coming up here. You know that. You've always known that. The second man laughed, short through his nose. Beatrix looked at him until he stopped. Then she looked back at Arthur. She stepped off the porch into the full force of the storm, walked the 8 feet between them, without rushing, stopped at arm's length. The wind drove snow against the side of her face, hard enough to sting. She didn't blink. "Get off my land," she said. "Beatrix, you rode 4 horses up a mountain in a blizzard to tell a woman she has no options." She held his eyes. "You're the one with no options. You've been watching this ridge for 2 months, waiting for me to break. I haven't broken. That's the thing that's eating you alive." She stepped back. "Get off my land before I stop being polite about it." Arthur's jaw tightened. He looked at the Winchester, looked at her face, looked at the Winchester again. He turned to his men, jerked his chin toward the horses. None of them spoke on the way down. The wagon creaked and groaned in the wind, and then the sound of it dropped away into the white, and she was alone again. She went back inside, bolted the door, stood with both hands flat on the table and listened to the storm. The stove popped once. The walls shuddered. Outside, the temperature was still falling, and she had 11 traps buried under 2 feet of new snow, and no way to know if they'd hold until morning, and the wood she'd stacked wasn't going to last as long as this storm intended to. She looked at the nail marks on the wall. Thursday. She was still here. She woke to the mare screaming, not the stamp of cold, not the short bark of something startled. A full scream, the sound a horse makes when the world has stopped making sense. Beatrix was off the floor and had her boots on before she was fully awake, the Winchester in her right hand, the door latch in her left. The cold outside hit her like a wall falling. The barn door was gone. Not broken the hinge pins had held, but the latch bar had cracked straight through dry oak, split by the sustained force of the gale, and now the door swung full open and full shut on each pulse of wind banging against the frame with a sound like cannon fire. Inside, the mare had pulled her tie rope to the limit and was spinning in the stall whites, showing all the way around her eyes, hooves punching the boards. Beatrix ran. The wind took her sideways on the second step. She got her footing back, dropped her shoulder into it, and covered the 30 feet to the barn, in a crouch, keeping low, where the gusts ran high. The door swung out at her. She caught the edge with her forearm, took the impact, shoved back. The wind shoved harder. She got both hands on the door, dug her heels into the frozen ground, pulled. The gale pulled back with the indifferent weight of something that did not know she was there. Her boots slid. An inch. Then another. The frozen mud gave nothing to grip. It was smooth and hard as iron, and her heel found no edge, no rock, no root. She felt her arms beginning to shake, not from cold, but from the kind of sustained effort the body flags before it fails. The door swung back, took her with it 2 steps, and she hauled it forward again through pure stubbornness, her teeth locked together, her breath coming in hard white bursts. She was losing. She knew what losing meant. The mare would injure herself before dawn. Without the mare, there was no hauling, no plowing in spring, no way down the mountain, that didn't take 3 days on foot. Without the mare, the calculus of survival on Iron Ridge changed entirely. She pulled until her shoulders burned. The door moved back 6 inches, and the wind reclaimed 8. Then a hand came over the top of the door. One hand. Huge. Bare even in this cold, the knuckles ridged and dark with weather. It slapped flat against the outer face of the door, high up where the leverage was better, and the door stopped moving. She looked up. He was on the other side, facing her through the gap, snow driving sideways across the space between them. He didn't speak. The wind made speech pointless. His eyes found hers, and he jerked his chin not away from the door, not a gesture that said, "Step aside and let me handle it." A gesture that said, "Find your grip and hold it." She turned back to the door, got her hands lower at the edge where the wood was thickest. He counted with his chin. 1, 2. On 3 they both pulled. The door came. Not easy, frothing about the next 30 seconds was easy, but it came inch by inch, the wind screaming in the gap as it narrowed. And then the latch side met the frame, and she threw the emergency rope over the hook she'd installed for exactly nothing, and everything looped it twice, pulled the knot closed. The door held. The mare was still moving in the stall. Beatrix went to her, that got a hand on her neck. Stayed there until the animal's breathing changed. It took a while. When she turned around, he was inside, pulling the barn door shut behind him. Snow covered his shoulders and the top of his hat. His coat was old elk hide, dark with age and use, and he wore it like a man who hadn't noticed the cold in some years. He was bigger than he'd looked from the street back in Bitter Creek. Most things looked smaller at a distance. He looked at the broken latch bar on the ground, pulled off his outer glove, crouched down, turned the wood in his hands, checking the grain of the split. "Got a spare bar," he said. His voice was low, not soft, just contained like a man accustomed to speaking only when something needed saying. "Shelf above the near stall," she said. He stood, found it, began fitting it to the bracket without being shown how. Outside, the storm hammered the walls with everything it had. Inside the lantern, Beatrix had grabbed off the hook on her way out, still burned in her left hand, throwing light across the barn floor, across the mare's settling flank, across the back of a man who had come up a mountain in a blizzard to answer a question he hadn't been asked yet. She waited. She made coffee because it gave her hands something to do. The storm had dropped to a steady push by the time they got back to the cabin, still loud, still mean, but no longer the kind of thing that moved a grown man sideways. Silas sat on the low bench near the stove, his hat off, his coat still on. He hadn't asked permission to stay. He hadn't asked for the coffee either. He just sat with his forearms on his knees and looked at the fire through the grate slats the way a man looks at something he's been thinking about for a long time. Beatrix set the tin cup on the floor near his boot. She didn't hand it to him. She took the chair across the stove and wrapped both hands around her own cup and looked at him straight. "You fixed the latch," she said. "Yes." "That doesn't explain why you're on this mountain." He looked up from the fire. His eyes were dark gray, the color of the sky before snow, and they held on her face with the kind of steadiness that had nothing aggressive in it, and nothing apologetic either. Just level. The way a good scale sits when it's found the true weight of a thing. "You come up here to laugh," she said. "You picked a long ride for a short joke, and if Vance sent you, nobody sends me anywhere. Then you want something. Land labor or—" She stopped. Reset. "Men don't climb a mountain in January for nothing." "No," he said. "They don't." He reached into his coat. Not the outer pocket, the inner one, the one worn close against his chest. He drew out a folded piece of paper and held it across the space between them. She didn't take it immediately. She looked at it. At the mud stain on the outside fold, brown and dried. At the 4 creases worn soft from repeated folding and unfolding. She knew what it was before she took it. She took it. She opened it and looked at her own handwriting. The notice she had written at the kitchen table in October, rewritten twice, posted at dawn, and had not looked at since she tore it off the board and dropped it in the mud of Bitter Creek's main street. The ink had run in places. The lower left corner was gone entirely dissolved by water, but the words were still there. Her words. The ones the men had read aloud in mocking voices while she stood among them. She folded it back up along his creases, not her own. "You pulled this out of the mud," she said. "Yes. And you read it. Twice." The fire popped. Outside, the wind found the corner of the roof and tested it. "Everyone down there read it too," she said. Her voice came out flat. She hadn't intended that, but she didn't correct it. "Every man on that street read it and decided I was either stupid or dangerous or both." Silas picked up the coffee cup, drank once, set it back on the floor. "They read a list," he said. "Things you were asking for. Things you weren't willing to go without." He looked back at the fire. "A man who's spent his life working a trapline alone reads that list different than a man who's spent his life standing on a boardwalk." She waited. "They saw demands," he said. "I saw someone who knew exactly what this mountain costs." He paused. "And wasn't willing to carry it next to someone who didn't." The stove ticked. The lamp on the table burned with a small, still flame. The draft had settled. The cabin had settled. Everything in the room was very quiet in the particular way of things that have been waiting a long time to be quiet. Beatrix looked down at the folded paper in her hands. Her knuckles were cracked and black at the edges, and one nail was still dark from the maul strike, and her hair was half out of its braid, and she was sitting in a four-wall cabin on a mountain that had been trying to kill her for 3 months. She set the letter on the table between them. She didn't say anything for a long time. Neither did he. The storm outside was already smaller than it had been an hour ago. By morning, the worst of it would be gone. By morning, other things would need deciding. April came slow to Iron Ridge. It came in the smell of wet bark and the sound of snowmelt running under the ice crust on the north slope, and in the particular light that hit the cabin windows at a different angle than it had for 4 months, lower, warmer, with something honest in it. The mud came back. The traps came up. The mare put weight back on her ribs. Silas had built the second stall in February, working by lantern light with timber he'd felled from the east tree line. He'd built it without being asked, the same way he'd fixed the latch bar, not to prove something, but because the work needed doing and he was there and capable of doing it. That was the whole of his logic as far as Beatrix could tell. It was sufficient logic. She had stopped waiting for it to reveal something worse underneath. She was splitting kindling on the porch when she heard the wagon. She didn't stop splitting. She listened to it, the creak of the axle, the particular rhythm of a team being pushed faster than the grade, warranted the way the sound bounced off the cliff face to the south and came back distorted. 2 horses, possibly 3 riders behind the wagon. Coming up the south approach. She knew that axle. She'd heard it outside the bank in Bitter Creek every month for 2 years. Silas came around the corner of the barn with a saddle blanket over one shoulder. He stopped when he heard it too. He looked at her. She looked at him. He set the blanket on the porch rail and leaned his rifle against the wall beside the door, not hidden, not aimed, just present. They waited on the porch together. The wagon cleared the tree line first. Then Arthur Vance on his bay gelding, and 2 men behind him, and a 4th driving. Arthur had dressed for the occasion, the good wool coat again, a hat without weathering on the brim. He was carrying papers in his left hand rolled and tied. He came up the last rise and saw the cabin, the smoke from the stovepipe. The new cord of wood stacked 6 feet high under the lean-to running the full length of the barn wall. The garden plot Silas had turned last week, dark and ready. The marten pelts stretched and drying on the south wall, 40-some of them worth more than Arthur's wool coat at any trading post in the territory. He saw Beatrix standing on the porch with her splitting maul resting across her shoulder. He saw Silas beside her. The bay gelding stopped without being asked. Arthur sat on it and looked at what the winter had produced, and his face did something complicated that ended in nothing readable. The men behind him stopped too. One of them said something low that the other one didn't respond to. The rolled papers in Arthur's left hand moved once a reflex, like a man reaching for something he's already lost. Beatrix looked at him for 3 seconds. The same duration she'd given him in Bitter Creek in January, enough to confirm what she already knew, not enough to suggest she found it worth more of her time. She dropped her gaze first, but only to pick up the kindling basket at her feet. She turned and walked through the cabin door. Silas reached down, took the saddle blanket off the rail, and followed her inside without a backward glance. The door didn't slam. It closed the way a well-fitted door closes when the frame has been properly squared, solid, clean, final. On the porch, 2 cats that had appeared in March from somewhere in the tree line sat in the new sunlight and regarded the wagon with the blank authority of creatures whose territory was not in question. Arthur Vance sat on his horse for a long time. The papers in his hand were a deed transfer document his lawyer had drawn up in February, written on the assumption that Beatrix would be either dead or desperate by the time the snow cleared, and that either condition would amount to the same thing. He looked at the stacked wood, the pelts, the turned earth. He looked at the closed door. He turned the bay around. The wagon followed. The men followed the wagon. They went back down the south approach the way they'd come, and the sound of them dropped away into the trees. And then there was nothing on Iron Ridge but the meltwater running under the ice and the wind moving through the new-budded pines and the smoke rising straight up from the cabin stove into an April sky that had finally decided to be clear. Inside, the coffee was still hot.